Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today we're talking with Andrew Bacevich about his new book, Twilight of the American Century. Andrew Bacevich is Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations at Boston University. He's the author of a number of books, including America's War for the Greater Middle East. And as I learned from reading the autobiographical essay, Professor Bacevich was an officer in the United States Army, a graduate of West Point, I think in 1969, served in the Vietnam War and also in Desert Storm, but he is most known, I think, for the essays that are in this volume, which represent his journalism and more polemical essay writing that he's done since leaving the military, I think. And I really look forward to this interview. Glad to have you on the program.
Well, glad to be with you.
All right, so the book Twilight of the American Century, as I was reading it, obviously a lot of essays on foreign policy, domestic policy, but some also on the study of history and the uses and abuses of history, particularly in shaping politics and imagery and symbols and things like that. So you ask a question in one of the essays, and so I'll ask you maybe to begin the interview. What's the point of being an American?
Well, I think that question is up for grabs.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a quote from a novel by John Updike, one of his Rabbit Anstrom novels. And Rabbit poses this question as the Cold War is winding down. I don't remember when exactly Rabbit was born, this fictional character, but probably more or less when I was born in 1947. And I have to say that as I was growing up, and even into my young adulthood, even into middle age, the answer to the question, what is being American about, related directly to the fact of the ongoing Cold War. The Cold War gave definition. The Cold War gave American life a definition. It was history unfolding, and I think that once the Cold War ended, we really found ourselves unable to collectively, as a country, as a people, answer the question, what's being American all about? Indeed, my forthcoming book, which will be out in the fall, God willing, really hones in on that specific point. It purports to be, I hope it is, a history of the post-Cold War era that identifies the illusions to which the end of the Cold War gave rise, and then the mistaken policy choices that ensued, culminating in the election of Donald Trump as president in 2016, which I think signifies a repudiation of a post-Cold War consensus.
Thinking about that post-Cold War consensus, surely one of the claimants for what it means or has meant to be an American in the post-Cold War era, penned by Francis Fukuyama, which you write about a lot in these essays, or you mention or reference it, which is the end of history narrative thesis.
Absolutely.
And what that launched or drove American politicians, foreign policy thinkers, foreign policy actors to do. Maybe spend some time talking
Absolutely.
about that. Yeah.
Well, the essay, in retrospect, is really not a very impressive work, but
Francis Fukuyama's The End of
Fukuyama's,
History.
Yeah, End of History. But the timing was perfect. I mean, the essay came out, I think it was 3 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the essay purported to explain the significance of the fact that the Cold War was coming to an end. And so he used this phrase, end of history. It wasn't that history had ended. He never claimed that. But that something very important, he said, had ended. And that was the argument about how to organize societies. An argument if we look specifically at the 20th century, was an argument on the left of people proposing Marxism and Leninism as the way to organize society. On the far right, fascism, Nazism as the way to organize society. And more or less positioned in the middle was the United States and like-minded countries who said that no, liberal democratic capitalism, that's the formula for organizing society. And Fukuyama, writing in 1989, said, well, that argument's now over. There is one answer, and the answer is our way of life, our system. And again, I think this was an enormous illusion. But by the way, it's a notion that Fukuyama himself subsequently repudiated. But it was an illusion that permeated the post-Cold War era, and I think gave rise to the excessive enthusiasm about globalization, about enthusiasm about American empire, gave rise to, I think, a deeply flawed conception of what individual freedom means. And again, all of those, to my mind, resulting in the earthquake of 2016, when a sufficient number of Americans said, we don't want to do that anymore, sufficient to give Donald Trump a majority in the Electoral College.
Yeah. Well, thinking, you have an essay, and you use a phrase or coin a phrase, history that matters. And the essay is history that makes us stupid. And there's a quote from you I want to read and maybe get your comment, because I think it fits in nicely with what we're discussing. You say, quote, so no less than was the case in the 1920s and 30s and the 1960s and 70s, the times call for revisionism. The task this time is to reframe the entire 20th century, seeing it for the unmitigated disaster that it was, and recognizing its profound moral ambiguity without, however, succumbing to moral equivalence, end quote.
Yeah, I mean, so my sense is that the cornerstone, the foundation of what Americans think of as history really comes down to World War II. The war that we remember as the Good War. And the war that seemed to erase everything that had gone before, erase World War I, erase the interwar period, the Great Depression, and the war that seemed to validate our way of life. And I mean, there was good things out of that. I mean, that perspective on World War II invested, I think, in the United States a sense of confidence going forward into the 50s and so on, that probably was, in many respects, useful. But this illusion of World War II as a good war impedes our ability to think more broadly and to think critically about what history is all about. And I think that it's, rather than thinking of World War II as this moment of triumph of, 1945, we win, we're on top of the world, I think it's better to broaden the aperture a little bit and recognize the extent to which the 20th century was a disaster.
Yeah.
And one to which we contributed. It wasn't as if that American behavior throughout was wise and virtuous and prudent and farsighted. That's simply not the case. So that's the revisionism I think is way overdue, to think again, for Americans to think again about the 20th century. It's not that there have not been historians who've not done this, but their efforts, for all practical purposes, are irrelevant. They haven't penetrated into the collective consciousness of the American people.
And the phrase "history that matters" also would contribute, as I was reading it, to the mindset of history is over and liberal democracy, as America defines it, has won. And then that launches us or gives us this, incredible enthusiasm about the post-Cold War environment.
Right, the triumphalism, the hubris.
Yeah, it's interesting too, the phrase "liberal democracy." I mean, I've wondered when that came into being, the use of that.
That's an excellent question, and I don't know.
Yeah.
And in a sense, even that is a little bit of an exercise in deception. What we really mean is secular liberal democracy. I mean, a mindset that, at a minimum, privatizes religion, and I think more broadly marginalizes religion, faith. Whether you are a believer or not, I don't think is irrelevant. But what's important is that signified a vast change in consciousness that has had and continues to have certain effects on our culture, on the way we conceive of social relationships, and whether one judges it good or bad, one has to at least acknowledge its existence. And that's why simply to say liberal democracy seems to me is not really a sufficiently broad phrase to encompass the mindset that has prevailed since the end of the Cold War.
No, you've mentioned several times the election of Donald Trump signaling or affirming an end to a post-Cold War narrative or trend or politics in America. So I want to read this paragraph, and I love the title of this essay from 2017, Slouching Toward Mar-a-Lago. You say, like it or not, the President of the United States embodies America itself. The individual inhabiting the White House has become the preeminent symbol of who we are and what we represent as a nation and a people. In a fundamental sense, he is us.
Well, I think that's, if we think about the presidency and the role of the presidency in American life, I think at least since the days of Franklin Roosevelt, that statement has been largely true. And the truth of the statement, the centrality of the presidency, of the importance of the individual who sits in the Oval Office as the quote-unquote leader of the free world, as the embodiment of us, I think that was actually reinforced once the Cold War ended, and this moment of seeming American primacy. Hence all the hoopla surrounding presidential elections. The endless campaigns.
It's already started.
The incredible media preoccupation with everything presidents say and do and where they go. All the paraphernalia of the presidency. I was thinking about that the other day. The helicopter, Marine One,
yes,
the plane, Air Force One. The fact that the president is followed by a military aide carrying the so-called football, with the president on his own authority.
Yeah.
Allowed to give an order to launch a nuclear strike. We've come, in a sense, to take all that for granted, and yet, if you step back and look at it, we have a monarch. We have a monarch, who serves a set term, but nonetheless, he is no longer merely the head of government of a republic, and I think that's pernicious. And in some senses, I think that the fact that Donald Trump sits in that office and rides that helicopter and rides around in that airplane has helped to bring the public to some understanding of how extraordinary and problematic has been the elevation of the president to this status. You sort of look at it and say, "How the hell did this happen?" Because it's not what George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams expected, I believe.
Yeah, that's something you say in the essays as well. People focus on Donald. I mean, and this is very evident in media coverage. This insane focus on Donald Trump, or I say insane, but incessant focus on Donald Trump as revealing problems in America. You say he's not a cause, though. He's a consequence. And I guess that's the quote that I read affirms that.
That's my view. He's cause. I'm not cause. He's consequence. He's symbol. And I think that one of the reasons that his critics react so violently to everything he says or does is that, maybe this is subconscious, it probably is, there's an unwillingness to acknowledge that in many respects he is an expression of who we have become, this crass billionaire, this philanderer, this noisy, narcissistic individual.
Largely
well, guess what? And historically ignorant,
Yes.
not even interested in learning.
Yeah.
Those are not uncommon qualities in the United States of America in the 21st century. I mean, I very much regret that he's the president, but I think that the fact that he became president has a significance that many among elites refuse to acknowledge. And another thing I would say, just as an extension of that, there seems to be, at least in some quarters, if you're writing op-eds for the New York Times or the Washington Post, this sort of sense that if we can just get the guy out of office, then all will be well. And I think that's another illusion. I mean, 60 plus million people voted for him. And if he's tossed out of office, there's 60 plus million people, maybe not 60 plus million, but a bunch of people who are basically going to think that what they would view as liberal elites have organized a coup, and they're going to be angry. So there's no doubt that the country is deeply divided, but getting rid of Trump is not going to reunify the country. Because the causes of division are much deeper than Donald Trump.
So I want to circle back. Many of our listeners know you as a trenchant critic of foreign policy choices this country has made after 9/11. But of course, as I'm reading these essays, you've got a lot to say about choices we've made before 9/11 as well. In these essays in this book, we have your critiques. Particularly after 9/11, and it's easy for me even to nod along, and I agree, you're right here about things that America did after 9/11. But as you know, that wasn't always the case. There was once very intense opposition to your thinking, and in some quarters there still is. But I guess my question to you is, how should America have proceeded right after 9/11? I mean, I think, before the catastrophe of the Iraq War and Afghanistan, how should a republic have managed a threat like Islamic terror?
Well, notwithstanding the horrors of 9/11 and 3,000 people murdered, it would have been good if we had some cool heads making policy who would be able to evaluate how serious the threat actually was. And terrorism does not pose an existential threat to the United States of America, never has. I think it's safe to say never will. It was and is a serious problem, but war is not the antidote. Now, I was not smart enough to be saying that at the time, may be clear. But there were people at the time. There were voices at the time that said, in public, in print, war, global war, is not the proper response to Islamic terrorism. The proper response is a police response to put together an international coalition, a massive, sustained police effort aimed at rooting out and destroying the terrorist networks. Collaborative effort, not one that somehow is dominated by the United States, because Islamic terrorism is a threat to many, many countries, to include countries that are not necessarily our friends in other respects. and I say police effort, I don't just mean, cops wearing uniforms, standing on a street corner, but police effort in the sense of national police forces, for us, the FBI, for example, and intelligence agencies, for us, the CIA, perhaps involving some paramilitary forces, some special forces. But the emphasis would have been on this is criminality. In response to criminality, at least the immediate response, not the only response, the immediate response to criminality is sustained police effort to identify the criminals and bring them to justice. Now, I know that, I believe that, such an effort would have taken a long, long time. But it certainly would have been more cost-effective than the path that we have followed, the path of war. And that's setting aside the fact that when Bush announced this global war on terrorism, that once having overthrown the Taliban in Afghanistan, he and his administration immediately set out to attack a regime that was not involved in 9/11 in any way whatsoever. Of course, that's Iraq. So the war mindset, and I have to say, it was a war mindset very much informed by ideology. We're not simply going to go defeat the enemy. We're going to defeat the enemy. We're going to overthrow regimes. And then we are going to bring democracy, because that is our self-assigned mission. I mean, here we're getting, the ultimate expression of post 9/11, or I should say post-Cold War hubris, that we imagine that we can bring democracy to much of the Middle East. Yeah. So, but nonetheless, basic point is we ought not to have defined the problem as one where war is the solution. We ought to have defined the problem as criminality on a vast and vicious scale, where the proper solution would have been emphasized police work.
On the essay opening this book is a letter from you to Paul Wolfowitz, who was Undersecretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration.
No, the Deputy Defense Secretary.
Deputy Defense Secretary, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What occasioned this letter that you wrote, and maybe unpack?
Well, it was the 10th anniversary. It was the 10th anniversary of the war, and he clearly was one of the half dozen people who were pushing to go after Saddam after 9/11. He probably was the first person to push for invading Iraq. He was, I think, of those who wanted to invade Iraq, let's include Vice President Cheney, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld. Wolfowitz was the one who genuinely and sincerely believed that overthrowing Saddam Hussein would not only result in Iraq becoming a peaceful democracy, but that would set in motion a process whereby the region would begin moving toward democracy. And he's totally wrong. I mean, we blew everything up. We spent trillions of dollars. We've lost thousands of American soldiers. Tens of thousands of soldiers have had their lives shattered. Hundreds of thousands of people who are not Americans have been killed. We shattered the stability, whatever the fragile stability in the region. And the story continues to the present day. And Wolfowitz has been silent. Now, I knew him a little bit.
Yeah.
And he was not my friend, It was no kind of intimate relationship. But I was able to watch him enough when he was the dean of the Johns Hopkins School of International Relations to appreciate that he is really, really, really smart, has a very sophisticated mind. And I am bothered that here we are all these years later, and to my mind, there's been no accountability. And to my mind, there's been no adequate explanation from people on the inside about how this disaster unfolded. There have been memoirs, President Bush wrote a memoir, Condoleezza Rice, Rumsfeld, Cheney. They've all published memoirs, but they're all basically self-justifying. They don't give us any understanding. I believe, even today, that Wolfowitz is the one person who would be able to provide a genuinely intelligent reflection on what occurred and the miscalculations that were made. And he's been silent. That's his choice. But I also believe, and I think I said in the letter, that he would perform a great service to his country if he would explain what happened and bring all his experience, intelligence, insight. Yeah. And then we might be able then to say, yes, there has been some amount of accountability.
Yeah,
there hasn't been.
You say in the letter, the question you ask him, how did preventive war, undertaken by ostensibly the strongest military in history, produce a cataclysm? And then, but you seem to sort of lay out maybe a way he might answer, which is to look to his mentor, Albert Wohlstetter, a famous foreign policy theorist from the Cold War. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, so Wohlstetter, Wolfowitz was a student of Wohlstetter in graduate school. Wohlstetter was a guy who I think never had a job in government. He was one of these sort of analysts, people just on the fringes of power, but listened to and respected, and was viewed as sort of incredibly bright, even if sort of an annoying jerk into his attitude toward other people that he didn't think were as smart as he was. And I think that one of the things that Wohlstetter introduced into policy discussions among people who fancied themselves to be strategists was the potential for hitting first. And I think that Wolfowitz embraced that idea. Now, he didn't embrace it just sort of out of the blue. He embraced it because right around the time the Cold War was ending, if you looked at the Desert Storm, it appeared that the United States military had achieved a level of mastery never seen in history. And it appeared that technology in particular provided a mechanism that was making war as never before. Clean, decisive, brief. You just kill the people you want to kill. Wouldn't kill everybody else, down the block. And I think Wolfowitz, not he alone, was swept away by this theory of warfare. And that was one of the reasons why he believed. And Wohlstetter was the kind of person who would encourage his belief that we could invade a country like Iraq, overthrow the government, and everything would be fine. And then incredibly dangerous, bogus sort of notions. And but he's the guy. Wolfowitz is the guy who could say, "Well, let me reflect on why at the time preventive war seemed like a good idea." And I mean good both in the sense that he thought it would work, and he believed that there was a moral case to be made for preventive war. And let me explain why those expectations were not met and where my thinking went wrong. And let me therefore draw conclusions about going forward, what we should think about when we think about going to war, and the risks involved, and the costs that are going to be paid, and who's going to pay the costs. It's not the analysts, it's not the Albert Wohlstetters of the world, that's for sure.
No, that's it's interesting thinking. The point was made at times of so those most enthusiastic about going to war had not actually served and couldn't really point to anyone close to them who was. Well,
that's not entirely fair.
Not entirely fair. I know, but
it's mostly fair.
But the point was made, and it seemed to strike home with a lot of people. You did serve for a number of decades, and you were
long ago.
Graduate of West Point. How did your time in the military shape your thinking about foreign policy? in these?
Well, I've come to believe so. Institutions tend to suppress one's capacity for independent and critical thought. If you're working for the New York Times and you're an ace reporter for the New York Times, you're probably not inclined to reflect too deeply on whether or not information technology is going to put the New York Times out of business as a newspaper. You're part of that team. That's how you make your living. Well, I think being in the military is one of the most all-encompassing institutions that one can possibly imagine. To be a soldier, professional soldier, that's a way of life. It's not simply an occupation. So, in my 23 years in the Army, although I think I fancied at the time that I was something of an independent thinker, the truth is that intellectually I conformed. The limits on my capacity for independent thought were rather severe. So opinions that I hold today about, for example, the Cold War and its evolution and its origins were not ideas that I entertained when I was on active duty. At the time, they would have seemed like heresies. So it was only after I left the Army that it was liberating. Again, none of this was conscious. I wasn't thinking at the time, oh, good, now I'm not in the Army, so I can think on my own. But I think that's what happened. And so the farther I got away from the Army, the more I embraced a new identity as a college professor. I think I became better able to reevaluate things that I had once taken for granted and come to a different perspective. Now, whether that perspective is true, that would be people would argue about. But it certainly, I was able to change my way of thinking about many subjects as I became a civilian. And for me personally, that experience has been gratifying. As I began then to write books or write articles, it was as if I was, exploring subjects that I was actually quite familiar with, but suddenly they all looked different.
Okay.
And it was exhilarating in some respects to try to express what understanding I had come to about these matters that I thought I had pretty much made up my mind about.
Thinking, we talked a bit about Paul Wolfowitz and civilian leadership regarding foreign policy, defense policy. Your thoughts on military leadership? The post 9/11 environment. I mean, and I guess we've been talking about your mind. Let's look at the level of generals, and you have an essay here on it was General Tommy Franks.
Yeah.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on the level of thinking, strategic and otherwise, there.
Well, there's not been a lot of strategic thinking on the part of the military. To tell you the truth, I don't think that the civilian leadership encourages that. I've written some about civil-military relations, the relationship between the senior military leaders and the senior political leaders. I think that relationship is fraught with dishonesty and distrust, and that in particular, actually, the post 9/11 is a particularly good illustration of this. The senior civilians, let's say people like Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld in particular, but also including Wolfowitz, didn't want to hear from the generals. Didn't believe the generals had much to offer, and they may have been right on that. And certainly didn't want the generals in any way to impede their efforts to do what they wanted to do. Now, if we look at the quality of generals, this is going to be a very broad statement that no doubt is not fair to particular individuals. But by and large, the senior officer corps has been pretty mediocre. I mean, who has been a thinker? Who has been someone let's say, a stature that we could compare to that of George C. Marshall in World War II, who was able to make himself heard with Franklin Roosevelt, who was respected as a strategic thinker. Didn't win every argument by any means, but at least was able to inject into the policy discussion a military perspective, and a military perspective that was, grounded in history, that was principled. I don't think anything like that's happened since 9/11. I'm not even sure, and I'm getting older, so my memory's going. But I don't even think I can recite the names of the JCS chairs for the last 15 years because they really don't matter very much. Not in the way that senior military officers once did. Now, that doesn't mean they're incompetent. I think in many respects they're probably exceedingly competent in terms of the bureaucratic requirements of generating analytical documents and statements, which they churn out regularly. I'm sure they're competent in an operational sense, so they can, if you want to invade a country, they can put together a plan that will, result in an invasion. But where they fall short, I think, is in marrying military thought to political purpose, because war is a political act. War makes no sense unless it's politically purposeful. And I don't know that the senior officers of the past generation or so have been up to that part of their job.
It seems the only example I can think of tactical, was academic, tactical, tied ostensibly to political objectives was the post-Iraq surge, or not post-Iraq, but surge largely done because of the Iraq War failure.
Well, you mean that we would say that Petraeus, who was I guess one of the principal architects of the surge, but certainly the person who implemented the surge, he certainly stands out among all the senior officers of his generation. But what were his outstanding attributes? I have to say that one of them, and I'm not the only one who said this, is that he understood PR. I mean, he understood how to cultivate politicians, journalists, and bring them around to becoming Petraeus fans. Now, if you look specifically at the surge and this notion of counterinsurgency, it's certainly true that his predecessors running the war in Iraq did poorly. It's certainly true that counterinsurgency, as implemented by Petraeus, had a very positive effect in terms of suppressing the level of violence from what it had been. It's not true that all of that resulted from Petraeus's own understanding of the problem. In fact, there were lower level commanders, H.R. McMaster was one of them, who in the field were coming to an understanding of the relevance of counterinsurgency even before Petraeus showed up. Nonetheless, we have to acknowledge the implementation of counterinsurgencies substantially reduced the level of violence. That's positive. That said, it didn't win the war, or more specifically, it didn't achieve the mission of bringing stability and order to Iraq. That doesn't mean that the fact that it fell short of real success is Petraeus' own fault, but it does say that counterinsurgency really was only a partial solution to the problem at hand.
Thinking, you quote Petraeus as saying we can't kill our way out of this problem, and I think he meant that with regard to the entire situation with terrorism. Um, I guess when I read that, I thought it's really a confusion of why one would even use one's military. I mean, the only reason why you use the military is to destroy the enemy for an objective, which suggests if you're thinking that way, we can't kill our way out of this. You're in some situation that cannot be controlled
Well, I think,
by a military.
yeah,
I mean, it's sort of bananas,
I probably phrase it a little bit differently than you did.
Okay.
I mean, in the sense that we go to war to achieve political purposes. The original sin, I think, of the post 9/11 period was we went to war for purposes that could not be achieved by war. We had chosen the wrong instrument, and down to the present moment, at this point, virtually the only person who understands that, I mean, in terms of a public figure, is, believe it or not, the President of the United States. So Donald Trump has denounced the invasion of Iraq as, in his words, the worst mistake in the history of all the U.S. foreign policy. Donald Trump wants to reduce our military profile in the region. Donald Trump wants to get out of Syria. He wants to get out of Afghanistan. I don't think he has a clue about how to do that in a way that would prevent even further damage. It is true that there's something about his instinct that is worth reflecting on. But of course, since he's Donald Trump, nobody in Washington, nobody who works for the New York Times or the Washington Post is even going to consider the possibility that in this case, Trump actually might be on the right track.
You use a phrase in one of your essays, if I remember correctly, the Israelification of U.S. policy during this time frame, and maybe it's still ongoing. Talk about that.
Well, my sense of Israeli security policy is that there's a phrase that Israelis use called mowing the lawn. And what it refers to is that an expectation that from time to time you're going to have to go out and, sort of slap your adversaries around a little bit to get them to behave. You're not using force because you think you're going to quote unquote win, or you think you're going to make the threat go away, but you're going to reduce it to manageable proportions. And I think when we look at what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, more recently in Syria, bombing Iranian targets, they've done it in Lebanon. It is a routine use of force to sort of maintain to reduce a threat without eliminating it. And I think somehow or other that's kind of what we've stumbled into. If you're an Israeli, you take it for granted that military operations, killing people happens all the time. That's just part of the environment that they have learned to accept. I think that's where we are. As a people, we've come to accept war as normal. There's no real expectation that we're going to win and that the adversary is going to give up. And I think that's it's an expression of strategic bankruptcy. You go back to those claims that have been made over and over and over again about we've got the best military in the world and we've got the best military that's probably ever existed. And we got a military that works hard. They're out there operating, we're dropping bombs, delivering missiles, drone strikes, but doesn't seem to do much of anything of significance. And it's in that sense, I think, that our approach to national security has come to resemble very closely the Israeli approach.
I want to change fields here. You write about a thinker that I'm interested in and have learned from, Christopher Lash. And I think Christopher Lash is appealing to you from what I gather because he has insights, I think, into this overall overall aspects of American domestic life in the post-Cold War period. What can we learn from Christopher Lash?
Well, I think he's one of the people that was troubled by the evolving definition of what we mean by freedom, tending toward radical individualism, tending toward self-gratification, and trading away a conception of a common good, of solidarity, and he warned against that with great eloquence. And he's a good example of a great public intellectual whose writing attracted very considerable attention, and yet whose impact, I think, is negligible. Says something about the way our country works, that these prophetic voices, and his was a prophetic voice, are heard, are briefly attended to, and then basically are ignored. So a lot of his writing is quite difficult, for me at least, but it's very worth reading and thinking about.
I read his book on progress, the American belief, or a mythic belief in progress. In a way, I suppose it's he is discarded because if you reflect on what he's saying, he is calling Americans to a more humble posture.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah,
and in a number of things. And
well, I mean, he is not somebody who he's an opponent of corporate capitalism. He's an opponent of the notion that if I can acquire more and consume more, that I will be happy. And that gets in the way of what, in many respects, is the principal engine of American life. So it's a call for modesty, for limits.
Yeah.
And we're not about limits. As a people, we're about limitlessness. More tomorrow, please.
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. An essay you write on the failure of American liberalism, which is obviously timely. How did American liberalism fail?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's failed in the sense that it's gone. I think the principal failure of American liberalism has been the inability to translate abundance, the abundance, that material abundance that has been so much part of what America is, to translate that into a durable definition of the common good. I think that's what I would say.
It's interesting. I mean, as I was reading your essay, and parts of it resonated with me. It was also this. And you mentioned it briefly. This idea of freedom no longer being, definitely a Cold War conception, but I think a conception that served America for most of its history of freedom under God. And now we have a lot of Americans who are self-norming, self-defining, and not accepting of any limits. It seems to me in a lot of ways, where does that lead? What type of a society does that?
Well, I think it leads to chaos, moral anarchy.
No, I think we're starting to get a pretty clear picture of it. and the question being, is there anything to be learned, or do we just keep persisting and keep going? It seems to be one clear consequence that's had political ramifications is, as I see it, is lonely, broken people starting to piece together maybe something is really wrong here, and that's reverberating throughout our politics.
Well, I agree with that, and maybe I'm pressing the point too far, but I think again, in some respects, that's what the 2016 election was about, of people who in the wake of the Cold War had been promised some type of utopia, and whose own experience showed that those promises were not being fulfilled. With regard to freedom, that there's an emptiness, a loneliness in our society. The people sit around staring at their smartphones for 6 hours a day. It's dispiriting. It's demoralizing. And the Americans who voted for Trump didn't vote for Trump because they said, "Oh yeah, he's the guy who understands this problem and is going to provide a solution." I think they did because they looked at the alternatives, most prominently Hillary Clinton, but also all those Republicans that Trump had to defeat in order to get the nomination.
Which was a large number of strange political story, yeah.
And a large number of Americans said, "I don't want anything to do with any of those folks." So they wanted to upset the apple cart, and upset, electing Trump seemed to be a way to do that. And I think the dispiriting part, and this goes back to sort of the liberalism, is that I don't see yet, maybe somebody will emerge, an individual, a coalition, a party that is going to take cognizance of what happened in November 2016 and propose an alternative path. What I hear is mostly, Trump's a jerk, he's stupid, and we're going to go back to doing what we want to do anyway. There's very little effort to really rethink globalization. There's little effort to rethink post-Cold War foreign policy with its excessive militarization. Little effort to take on board the critique of somebody like Christopher Lash with regard to, well, what does freedom mean? What responsibilities go along with freedom, along with the privileges. So the political scene in that regard, to me, is pretty discouraging.
Professor Bacevich, on that note, why don't we come to an end on that dispiriting note? We've been talking with the author, Andrew Bacevich, of Twilight of the American Century. Thank you so much for your time. This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.